Well, thank you so much for joining us today, everyone, during your lunch hour. I hope you're comfortably seated with a meal and a nice beverage. We're in for a really, really good discussion today. But quick intro before we begin. My name is Smash. I am a member of the Toronto chapter of Young Canadians in Finance. Quick background on who Young Canadians in Finance is or what the network's about. We are a network of mostly young Canadians in finance, some in law, across Canada. We have chapters in Toronto, Montreal, Vancouver, and Ottawa. Our network was founded in 2006 by two highly ambitious individuals, the esteemed Paul Desmarais III and Michael Blickstead. We have grown quite a bit since, but especially so since the onset of the pandemic, when we had to shift, like everybody else, all our activities online. And as you probably noted from our LinkedIn page, we really, our mission here is twofold. It's one, to provide a platform for young Canadians in finance and in law to unite, to network with each other and to learn from each other. And two, to bring out thought leaders like our guest here today to inspire thought leadership among our members, and also to speak in depth on topics and issues that affect us broadly here in Canada, such as today's topic. And since the advertisement of this fireside chat just last week, the state of Georgia passed a new law, a span of just a few hours, restricting ballot access. And then a few days prior, Facebook, Apple, Amazon, and Google underwent yet another unproductive congressional hearing. There were talks of penalties, but no mention of innovation or new frameworks to incentivize change behavior. These two seemingly separate events are intertwined and reinforce the threat of further democratic backsliding. So we're extremely pleased to host Peter Biro. He is an entrepreneur, a political commentator, both in French and in English, and former partner at two of Canada's distinguished law firms, and another feather in his cap, author of a multitude of publications, including his latest release in the form of a book, Constitutional Democracy Under Stress, right here. Visual. If you're interested in learning about the state of our democracy today, this is a really nice collaborative effort with Peter and a number of other individuals who are also thought leaders in their own right. I will provide a link to this book if you're interested in picking it up. It is a heavy read, but a compelling one, and I highly, highly recommend adding this to your list of to-reads. And now, with that, Peter, thank you so much for joining us today.
My pleasure to be with you. And how dare you call it a heavy read? What kind of way is that to plug a book? No one's going to touch it.
A heavy read in a good way. It's a very, very compelling read. I mean, I'm
teasing.
Through. So Peter, before we begin, I'm going to put you on the spot real quick here. I want to ask you, what got you to advocate for Canadian democracy to start?
To advocate for Canadian democracy? Well, I begin by, before advocating for anything, trying to really understand, what we're all about as enlightened or aspiring enlightened citizens in a society that considers itself to be free and values, according to our Constitution, democratic principles. The advocacy piece begins not so much from a passion for democracy itself, because as Winston Churchill famously said, and this will be a very poor paraphrase, a number of ways of organizing our society and systems of government have been tried and been found wanting, and democracy is essentially the best of a very, very bad lot. That's not his phraseology. He's actually saying it was the worst system of government, except for all those others that have been tried before. My passion for advocacy comes from my observation about the consequences of illiberal, undemocratic society for the quality of life of our citizens and of civil society broadly. So it really comes from a sense of deep concern about things going wrong and wanting to kind of right the ship of civil society, if you will.
Got it. So then on that, let's start at the root causes of democratic backsliding then. What, you published an article back in January, actually late December, where you eloquently point out the causes of democratic backsliding and attribute a lot of that to, a war on truth. But before we get there, what are some of the causes of democratic backsliding?
Well, I'd preface my answer by talking about what democracy requires in the first place, so that we can understand what the backsliding looks like. And of course, democracy, requires a commitment to certain values and principles and to certain institutions which effectively reflect and express those values and principles, such as freedom of expression, freedom of assembly, freedom of conscience, those basic liberties. The institutions that enable us to remain free and to treat each other with respect and to hold us accountable when we don't, such as an independent judiciary free of political influence, an independent prosecutorial branch, independent and free of political influence, the separation of powers between legislative and executive functions in a government. And of course, we're talking about democracy, free and fair and indeed meaningful elections for all positions of significance in society. So there's a long laundry list of other sort of criteria for identifying what a free and democratic society looks like. But those are some of the biggies. The causes of democratic backsliding, I'll begin with the idea that liberal democracy itself is probably not managed to very effectively keep its key promises of delivering freedom and democracy. And most importantly, in the post-war period, by which I mean the post-Second World War period, it has apparently failed, by all accounts, to deliver on its promise of just distribution and of relative economic equality, which doesn't mean people living the same, living standards and having the same amount of wealth, but it does mean that wealth, as it is generated in a market economy, and for that matter, in any kind of economy that wants to call itself democratic, has to be distributed in a way that all gains to the most privileged and the most successful and to the wealthiest have to have a corresponding increase in benefit to the least advantaged. Those of you listening who may be familiar with the political philosopher John Rawls might have heard or read about what he refers to as the difference principle. That what I've just sort of articulated is a very, very crude and inadequate formulation of that difference principle. So, the failure to keep the promise of economic equality, or to put it differently, economic inequality, which has grown exponentially year over year, both as to income gap, but also more importantly as to wealth disparity, is probably the most important cause. But there are a lot of other causes. The rise of right-wing populism, a kind of illiberalism that has responded in a way to the grievances of large segments of the population that have felt either left out or betrayed by the system, and therefore manages to identify, mobilize, and indeed weaponize that disenchantment against the status quo, if you will. So that's a massive cause. The failure of political parties to weed out, to fulfill its filtration function of weeding out aspiring autocrats in their leadership competitions, aspiring autocrats and those otherwise unfit for office in a free and democratic society. So people like Donald Trump or Bolsonaro or Orban or others get into power when really a well-functioning Republican, by which I mean small r, Republican or liberal democratic, party system would weed people like that out before they got very far. around the bases. The departure by leaders from adherence to the norms that are so central to liberal constitutional democracy, the respect for the independence of the judiciary, the respect for the authority of the legislative branch to oversee and to bring to bear appropriate scrutiny and oversight to the actions of the executive branch. Things like that are serious causes. And then, of course, there's the internet itself, and that kind of begins to dovetail with, I think, the subject that you want to talk about today, which was, disinformation and the war on truth. So maybe I'll stop there because that is, certainly my central preoccupation, and so one that maybe I'll answer following your intervention now, rather than to go into it, because I'm not sure which way you'd like to take this.
Yeah, well, I kind of alluded to it earlier. It's the war on truth. That's the phrase you use in the article. And so, I mean, go ahead, maybe give us a little bit more color as to the source of this disinformation, or the biggest source of this disinformation.
Well, let me again, with apologies, preface the answer or qualify the answer a little bit, because you need a little bit of background. Obviously, we can jump right to the subject matter of disinformation, disseminated by hostile forces, and by hostile, I mean both domestic and foreign, who have a mission to disrupt the status quo, to destabilize our society. It's what the Russians have been doing. It's what the troll farms at the Internet Research Agency in Moscow is all about, and what the Chinese have been doing, and what other governments have been doing. But sort of before getting into specifically the issue of disinformation itself, I think we should take a step back and just talk a little bit about truth. A liberal democracy, in other words, a free and democratic society, all right, for purposes of a kind of shortcut articulation of what I mean by liberal democracy, requires a vibrant and healthy and functioning marketplace of ideas to operate, all right? It's premised on the idea that if people speak freely, no matter how foolish or misguided or even hostile their speech might be, and certainly regardless of how unpopular it might be, the marketplace itself will operate as a kind of clearinghouse of bad ideas and good ideas, and weeding them out, as a kind of place in which the good, the smart, the objectively demonstrable, in other words, the true or truth, right, will win out in this marketplace of ideas where people are free to express themselves and to float ideas and to level criticism both at theories as well as at people and institutions. Right? The problem is that marketplace of ideas is not operating in a healthy way at all. In fact, I would submit we don't have a vibrant marketplace of ideas anymore. It exists in certain quarters, but it doesn't exist in the way that it used to. I would say that rather than a marketplace of ideas, we've got info wars. What we've got is both the internet and the airwaves and all media of communication being used to wage wars not only against specific ideas, but more fundamentally against the very idea and primacy of truth itself, all right? In other words, it's one thing for bad arguments or unpopular arguments to be disseminated. And not only is there nothing wrong with that, it's a good thing, because that in a vibrant marketplace of ideas allows us to sharpen our own arguments and to reflect critically on our own positions as well as those of others. It's a good thing. And that's what free speech is all about. The problem is when the purpose or the purpose of the exercise, that is the dissemination of information or speech, is in fact to disrupt the marketplace of ideas, to throw it off the agenda of being the ultimate, truth determinant, all right? The ultimate arbitrator or arbiter rather, of the true and of the sound, but instead to actually disrupt and to perpetrate falsehoods that are known to be falsehoods. And in fact, to cause the general sort of community of participants in public discourse to begin to lose confidence in the very idea of truth itself, in the certainty that we can know anything at all with any degree of authority, provisional or otherwise. That becomes a problem. Let me give you a silly example, and I give you more serious ones, but a silly one that just sort of puts this in evidence. I think a lot of people will remember when Sean Spicer was the White House press secretary, and he came out the very first day and talked about this incredible crowd size that Trump had for his inauguration, said it was the largest crowd ever to witness an inauguration. That was provably, demonstrably false. It was also knowingly false. It was a lie that was disseminated. And ordinarily, when lies are told, the marketplace of ideas functions or operates to actually adjudicate and to be able to kind of disqualify the lie. But what happened was very, very different, not only in that instance, but in much more significant instances right up to the present time. And we'll talk about a couple of very important and consequential ones. The next day, Kellyanne Conway, the presidential counselor, as she then was, came out to defend Sean Spicer against the press's allegations or accusations or charges that what he said was blatantly false. And rather than to try to defend his position and to prove that, in fact, no, he was accurate and to point to the evidence that supported it, or alternatively to criticize and disprove some other sort of version of history and of facts, Kellyanne Conway uttered the now famous or infamous phrase that, there are facts, but then there are also alternative facts. And Sean Spicer, in her view, was entitled to his alternative facts. Now, the significance of that was to say, we don't care really about truth anymore. We don't care about adjudicating between whose position, whose observations, whose data, has greater integrity. We're now in the realm where we can simply dismiss or disregard altogether views of reality or statements about the truth, or what we call truth propositions. Just dismiss them and ignore them out of hand and simply proceed with our lie, because after all, we're entitled to our own lies. Now, we are entitled to our own lies, but when governments and leaders and political institutions take it upon themselves as a matter of their official undertakings to promote lies, what we end up with is the Capitol Hill riots. What we end up with is voter suppression laws in Georgia and now elsewhere about to be on the books soon in the United States. And of course, I'm focusing on the United States because we here in Canada, are very kind of attuned to American politics. But what I'm talking about is not only every bit as true, but in fact, even more true and more sinister in many ways in other parts of the world. But think about the consequences of this, because the voter suppression legislation that we see and there's no reason to couch that, by the way, that's what it is. It's not voter integrity or election integrity legislation. It's legislation clearly designed to limit the impact of the suffrage of a certain constituency in the United States in order to avoid the losses that the Republicans suffered in this most recent election, both in the Senate and at the presidential level. Well, that legislation is being justified by the lie that there was voter fraud, that there was election fraud, that there were all kinds of things, that the election was stolen, that there was an integrity problem in the November election, and then even in the subsequent January 5th Senate election, 4th or 5th, I can't remember the date, in Georgia. Well, that's a lie. The problem is the lie now has consequences, and the lie has legs. It has legs. So we don't have a marketplace of ideas operating where it's possible in that scenario to consider the evidence for and against, election fraud in November. And to the point where the independent judiciary, which had, always been thought of as one of the key venues in which a certain type of truth is sought out. And, courts are not so much about truth and falsehood as they are about the integrity of certain types of propositions, and they're about rights and other things. But at the end of the day, truth claims are made before judges, and the truth claims about the election were made and unanimously dismissed by every court in the land. Substantively in the United States, that is the so-called truth claims about election fraud. That didn't seem to matter because over the past 4 years, the Trump administration had managed to sow so much mistrust and cynicism about the validity and the authority of independent courts, and about the authority and validity of scientific propositions, and about the authority and validity and reliability of journalistic observations and reporting, that it was possible to lose in the courts and to still have tens of thousands of people storming the Capitol on the basis of the lie, and millions of Americans, as far as polls seem to indicate to this day, believing those lies. So there's just a little bit of a context for what the war on truth is doing. Now, let me just add to this. I see the war on truth happening on a couple of different levels, 3 different levels. Number one, in the advancement, as I've just said, of complete falsehoods, knowing they are falsehoods, intending them to be believed. It's what we used to call propaganda. Joseph Goebbels taught the world a great deal about that during the Third Reich. And it's a technique that is being employed by Trump and others around the world and adopted wholesale. And so that's the intention to deceive and not to care about it, because the purpose is not about truth seeking. It's about disruption. It's about displacing a certain power structure and replacing it with something else. So that's one context. The other is simply the war on truth altogether. The idea that we tell people that they can no longer rely on what anyone says, and they can't rely on the marketplace of ideas to adjudicate. And that means the academy. It means scientific research. It means the editorial pages and the journalism broadly. We can't rely on any of that to tell us what is true and what we should believe. Finally, there is the dissemination of falsehood, what we really literally narrowly refer to as the disinformation industry. I referred to it earlier. The troll farms, the efforts by specific entities to disseminate falsehoods for really malign purposes or malicious purposes, to disrupt our government, to cause disruption in civil society broadly, to infiltrate. The implications are very, very serious when China or Russia or any other government seeks to disrupt our elections or seeks to disrupt the way in which we consume information for the public good or in the name of the public good. Let me give you an example. In order to succeed in combating this pandemic that the world is in the midst of, even assuming or fantasizing for the moment that scientists are all on the same page and that we all understand what's going on, right? Assuming that were the case in the science, you still need a certain kind of social cohesion, a certain kind of broad consensus in society to be able to combat something like a pandemic effectively. If you only have certain pockets of citizens doing, the right thing, so to speak. That doesn't help in a pandemic. You need everybody on the same page. And I think, the same is true for global challenges such as, for example, climate change, combating global warming. And if you cannot generate broad consensus, then you cannot act effectively in a cohesive way, in a unified way. Now, non-democracies manage to do this very easily. Authoritarian regimes simply impose discipline in a variety of ways. That's why China was much more successful in getting their pandemic or their outbreak under control at an early stage. Now, the cost to freedom and democracy and to civil society is huge in a system like that. But they achieve consensus in that way. They don't care about whether you agree or you don't agree. You're forced to agree. But in a democracy, you've got to enlist the population. You've got to bring them along. And therefore, truth really does matter. Having people come to some conclusion, to some kind of judgment, and having a marketplace of ideas that functions, that has integrity, that people trust, is absolutely vital to the survival, of democracy itself, and obviously to our ability to successfully combat a pandemic. But I say even more fundamentally, to liberal democracy itself. Without that ability to achieve broad consensus, not to coerce it, not to threaten, but actually to use rational discourse, science, observation, and critical conjecture and refutation, in the public square, in the marketplace of ideas. You can't do that, you're doomed. Let me stop there.
I do want to be mindful of our time here. I want to leave room for Q&A as well, and I'm sure our audience has some questions for you. So I'm going to move right along and maybe ask you, with respect to Canada's involvement in this, right? We are so often overshadowed by the developments in the U.S. As I had mentioned earlier, the big four tech companies just had a congressional hearing. I mean, at least there's some movement in our southern neighbor, but we're not really hearing any movement on that end in Canada. And I know you were a vocal proponent of making changes happen. I know there was an agency that was established.
Well, it wasn't established. It was proposed.
Proposed, right?
Yeah.
So really, no movement. And so could you talk a little bit about that with respect to Canada's case and what's happening locally here on that end?
Well, that's an easy answer. Nothing. And that's not that nothing is happening in Canada, but there's nothing happening at the government level that is really worthy of note. Okay. What we should be doing is on a number of different levels. First of all, in terms of educating kids in schools, the way the Scandinavians have already begun to do it, an early digital media education that provides kids with the tools to critically assess information that they're consuming every day. Civil servants need to also be doing that. We're not doing any sort of training like that. Our government in Canada is doing nothing to bring social media and the big four, Apple, Google, Facebook, and Amazon under. You could add Microsoft to it, but they're different case in certain ways. Sort of under proper kind of scrutiny and regulation and control. And social media has become on one level, obviously, a democratizing force in the sense that it's enabled everybody, you and I and everyone else, to sort of, log on, surf the internet, look up anything we want to look up, and also communicate anything we wish to communicate and share it with whoever we want. There's a democratizing sort of dimension to that. The problem is it's not really curated in a proper way at all, and it allows participants effectively to become manipulated, and has turned us, the users, especially of social media, into not consumers, but actually commodities. We become the commodity. We are organized by others, by the market research industrial complex under the umbrella of Amazon and Facebook and the like, who have organized social media in a brilliant way. We are addicted to it, and I'm not going to go into the reasons for that, but there's amazing work that's been done by people like Ron Diebert at Citizen Lab, who's written a book and dedicated an entire sort of life's work to trying to bring the internet, to make the internet, to reclaim the internet for civil society. But what social media is doing effectively is amplifying a tendency that we already have, which is to congregate with those with whom we already agree. The social media bubble, is very, very corrosive of any kind of healthy, open, progressive discourse. So Canada, from a regulatory point of view, is doing nothing. There's and that it should do. I would suggest that even at the level of national security, we're not doing nearly what we should be doing to defend against the malign activities of foreign actors in particular. Now, we know in the United States, going back to the American experience, that it was both a case of foreign actors, but also domestic actors perpetrating, or promoting and disseminating, blatantly false, misleading, and indeed very, very harmful information for purposes, for a variety of purposes. We've referred to some of those. The Americans haven't done a great job of bringing it under control either, and Congress, has tended to respond in a very, very pathetic way. First, trying to flex its antitrust muscle, which is not, and there needs to be some serious antitrust measures that are implemented. These big robber barons like Facebook, Google, and Apple and Amazon do need to be broken up for a variety of reasons, because the deleterious effects of the anti-competitive universe that they promote and protect is terrible for democracy. It's terrible for freedom. It's terrible for the problem of wealth and income inequality, and a whole host of other reasons. But they're not doing the really important and much more sophisticated regulatory work that they need to do. I mean, everyone's obsessed with, Section 230, which is all about, basically insulating the social media companies and the internet companies from liability for the falsehoods that are promoted and presented on their platforms. But that doesn't even go, and there was a salutary or positive reason for that in the first instance. It needs to be reconsidered in a hurry. There are big problems for it because, as we know, these social media companies are indeed publishers. They are, in fact, media. They are disseminators of information, and they need to be made much more responsible for the information that they disseminate on their platforms, but also for the type of engagement, the type of discourse that occurs on their platforms. And of course, people will, wave the, freedom of expression flag in the First Amendment in Canada, Section 2B of the Charter, and say, well, you can't interfere with people's ability to express themselves. You've got the Trump supporters saying that, Trump's excommunication from Twitter and Facebook, is a violation of his First Amendment and of his, rights and his freedom of expression rights. But people, of course, forget that these are private companies, that neither the U.S. Constitution nor the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms protects anybody's right to say whatever they want on a platform such as Facebook. And it's a different regime that would need to apply to regulation of speech in that context. But that's perhaps another discussion.
Yeah, it's really unfortunate how even if the force resources the U.S. has, a little tragic to see, basically no movement either on their end in terms of regulating tech companies.
Let me make one point, because I know our time is short, and I just checked in on the chats, and I see that one person made a very, very, very important observation, which had to do with what the left is responsible for in terms of the war on truth. And I wholeheartedly agree, but it's doing it in a different way, and it's every bit as problematic and as serious. And I know my friend Stephen Reich is on here. He and I just had a very sort of elaborate and a deep discussion about this yesterday or the day before. I mean, we're very, very concerned about what is happening on the so-called left. Now, I don't like actually to refer to the left or the right, not because I want to deny the existence of left-wing and right-wing constituencies and thought. Of course, political theory is all about, at least not all about, but partly about figuring out how we, understand our allegiances and convictions along what used to be known as the ideological left-right axis. But the problem is left and right doesn't mean really what it used to mean anymore. And as Stephen and I were discussing the other day, there really is a complete lack of ideological coherence, so that people who hold views on one issue that may be sort of traditionally associated with the right or the left will also hold other positions that are completely contradictory, and that in the good old days would have belonged to the other camp. But let me say this about that comment, and I think it was Marco Bao who made this comment online. The problem of what's going on the left is a little bit different. The right-wing assault on truth, in a lot of ways, is easier to deal with because it's a full frontal assault. It's not very sophisticated. No offense to my conservative friends. It literally is basically, sort of taking the position that something is true, something is false, and if you don't agree, you're unpatriotic, okay? Or you're not a true American or a true patriot or whatever. It's much more Machiavellian in the sense that there is a built-in design in the right-wing approach to the war on truth, a built-in design to effectively disrupt, all right? On the left, it's very, very different. And some of you might disagree with me on this, but my view is that the left-wing approach, what I refer to as kind of groupthink, that has led to things like, of course, notions of cultural appropriation, of cancel culture, and a whole host of consequences, social consequences, political consequences, and indeed even legal consequences that flow, I would submit, from the evolution and ultimately the devolution of the human rights revolution that started almost 50 years ago. I think there are, at base, good intentions on the left. Good intentions makes people a lot more dangerous. When you're really, really convinced of the righteousness of your cause, in a lot of ways, you're a more dangerous and lethal opponent than if you're very cynical about what you're doing. I think, generally speaking, the left strongly believes in the virtue and in the fundamental importance, the cardinal importance now of the equity, diversity, inclusion sort of model for how we judge speech, for how we organize institutions, for how we hire, for how we evaluate political action. And that's very, very dangerous because it's uncritical. It's purely ideological. And in being purely ideological, it invalidates positions that are critical. It invalidates positions that seek to bring critical scrutiny to bear on any aspect of the project, of the mission, of the EDI mission. And not only that, but people are labeled racists, they're labeled reactionaries. Effectively, they're labeled, they're excommunicated from polite society as we now understand it, and dismissed out of hand if they aren't towing the line on the issue of what social justice should look like in a particular context. And you can bring this down to the level of any particular social justice or context or a struggle that you may want, whether in sort of in the labor context, in the indigenous rights context, in gender and gender identification context, and a whole host of other contexts. The problem is that truth appears not to be important either in that context, although it's couched in language of righteous commitment to justice, which makes it more difficult to accuse people in that camp of betraying the very principles of a free marketplace of ideas that could allow people to come together honestly and without fear of reprisal and exclusion for speaking honestly and critically. So to Marco Bao, I agree wholeheartedly with his observation, and I'm very, very concerned about the problem. Very, very concerned about it.
Thanks, Peter. We have more questions for audience. We have minutes.
Sorry, are you looking for questions or?
Yeah, so we actually have a question that was just submitted a couple minutes ago. Do you think the ideological and political situation in Latin America and Cuba has impacted politics in the US and could eventually impact the Canadian society?
Okay. Buenos dias, Sandra. I can honestly say that I almost wish it were the case that the situation in Latin America and Cuba impacted politics in the United States. Frankly, I don't think it does, or in Canada, and it should. We, particularly in Canada, are just utterly oblivious of Latin American culture, Latin American politics and civilization, except when engagement there is useful primarily for trade purposes, historically sometimes for other purposes as well. Just think of Kissinger's foreign policy in Chile and in other parts of South America and Latin America, from a geopolitical standpoint. So there's a lot of very important stuff going on in Latin America. I don't think it is impacting American or Canadian society, except in the sense that Americans, or some Americans, as we know too well, are using the illegal immigrant sort of issue as a kind of whipping horse and a pet project to attack humanitarian policies with respect to refugees and to a healthy sort of approach to immigration more broadly. In the case of Cuba, they're back and forth between Obama and Trump, and now we're back to Biden. We haven't yet seen what his policy in Cuba is going to be, but we can surmise that it will kind of go back towards the Obama position of being more open to not only dialogue but engagement, both diplomatic and political, but also commercial and cultural engagement with Cuba. Cuba, it's not so much what's going on in Cuba that matters, but Cuba, again, is a convenient, kind of straw man for people on one side or the other of of the ideological battle between the right wing and the left wing in the United States, or rather between Republicans and Democrats in the United States.
Cedric asks, anything actionable you could suggest on both sides of the spectrum?
Yes, yes. Unfortunately, what's actionable is not easy. And it starts, and it has to start with a proper civics education. It means that really we're looking at, aspiring to kind of generational improvement. It's not something that can happen overnight. The kind of civics education I'm talking about, which is in fact what Section 1, my initiative or think tank, if you will, is all about, is dedicated to the idea that in order to really combat democratic backsliding and to make and to rehabilitate truth as a value, as a cultural value, and as a political value, you need an education that inculcates, and I don't mean indoctrinates, I'm not talking propaganda here, that inculcates in citizens a love of truth, a love of engagement, and a sense of duty, almost at a visceral level, not just at an intellectual level, but on a visceral level, a sense of duty to come to the defense of political liberty and to respond to and combat unaccountable government wherever you find it, in whatever ways you as a citizen choose. That may sound like, a lot of pie in the sky, and that doesn't sound like a very appealing solution, because it's something that requires a kind of whole of government approach. It requires already that we generate consensus around this kind of an initiative. It means that civics education, it must not only be compulsory, but it needs to be a core part of the curriculum from kindergarten all the way through to graduation from high school and beyond. In fact, civics education needs to continue in other spheres of activity, and it needs, in a way, to continue to be promoted in all of the institutions and all of the settings that we encounter, in our civic life. So that's number one, and it's massive. And obviously, we don't have time to talk about what that kind of education would look like, but a lot of people have given it some thought, and that's got to be where it begins. Secondly, leadership. We need leaders. We need some leaders to come, to the fore who actually are committed to this, who believe what I'm saying right now, and are prepared to put their own necks on the line for these values and principles. And that's a tall order. That may be, a bit of a fantasy, but there are leaders out there, and perhaps some of you today are among them. And of course, there are many other measures. There's all kinds of regulatory measures we can speak about, but at the end of the day, I don't believe in kind of playing around the edges. I don't believe in the incremental, sort of mild approach. There's a fundamental sea change that needs to occur. We need to recognize that the assault on truth, that the war on truth in all the iterations and incarnations that we discussed today is a massive, massive threat to the future of liberal democracy, of our freedom, of our democracy, and of our way of life. And we've got to address it head on. It's got to become a government priority. Not easy to sell. Not easy to sell. A pandemic is much easier because people see death. They see hospitalization. They see immediate consequences. Even climate change doesn't elicit the kind of response that it ought to, because we don't see it happening at warp speed, even though indeed it is, right? So this, a fortiori, the problem of civics education is even harder to sell and to get people excited about, but it would be my number one priority.
Yeah. What do you suspect is the biggest bottleneck? I mean, it's clearly an item of priority for the Canadian government to address tech regulation, but I mean, it's on the back burner for now, and they're not going to address it till way later this year, perhaps next year if we're lucky. what is the biggest bottleneck? Is it lack of resources, lack of, or is
No,
it?
it's lack of courage, lack of political courage, and a lack of will. That's the short answer. So lack of integrity at the political level. If one wants to give governments sort of the benefit of the doubt on this, and there's no reason that we ought to, one might say that they just don't understand the problems well enough. And even as that is undoubtedly true, there's no excuse for not understanding the problems well enough. There's simply no excuse for it. So I wouldn't say there's a bottleneck. I would say there's a power imbalance. And the big tech, if you want to call it that, label it that, knows its own mission much better than government does. It's much more focused and it's much more powerful. I mean, if I'm going to, decide if I'm going to put Amazon and the government of Canada in the ring, I know who my money is on in that match. Unfortunately, it's not the government of Canada. And when we say government of Canada, what we really mean is the people, the citizens of the country. So, the short answer is there isn't the political will to do the difficult things that take longer, things that require sacrifice, resources, and that require a lot of hard work at every level and require time, none of which is in great abundance.
And so I was actually quite surprised that the social media regulation with respect to journalism, partnering up with the Australian government to ensure that media content's paid for. I mean, I was actually quite surprised given the slow development, right, on our side, that Canada tackled that at all.
Well, don't give the Australians all that much credit. I mean, that's not a victory for democracy or for free speech. That's a victory for Rupert Murdoch. Okay, that's one big tech company doing a deal with another dominant big media and tech company, News Corp, in Australia. And yes, it's sold as being a real victory for free speech and for the rights of content owners and content creators. Okay, but fundamentally, it's really just a business deal that allows Rupert Murdoch, who owns Fox News, as through News Corp, as we all know, to simply make a bit more money, and for Facebook in particular and Google to be able to claim that they are honoring and acknowledging and accounting for the legitimate sort of intellectual rights or intellectual property, of the creators of the content, of journalists, of writers. But in fact, that's not really what's happening. So yes, there's a regime that's in place. Let's not imagine for a moment that is an answer. That's the private sector figuring out how to use the problem that we're talking about right now, among other things. Mutual benefit to keep Facebook and Google and the others, in business, and to make them look like responsible, corporate citizens.
Yeah, right.
And by the way, in saying this, it's not that I'm opposed to the idea of Facebook and the others paying for the content. Not at all. I support it wholeheartedly. But let's just understand what that particular exercise was. I think it's quite proper to be cynical about it and foolish to laud it as being some kind of a great nod to the rights of those people who are journalists in the first instance for a living, and writers and researchers and content creators. It was never about that.
Right. It's more about the revenue that's at stake.
Well, it's more about big tech retaining its hold on the public square. That's what it is. Rather than to retreat as Google and Facebook threatened to do. Okay, if you're not going to play ball with us, we're just going to take our toys and go home. We're not going to play in your sandbox. But of course, that wouldn't be good for Google or Facebook either, right? So here this way they retain the market and they look like good, decent, ethical corporate citizens.
Right.
Democracy actually loses.
Yeah, no, I wholeheartedly agree with you. I meant more so from the Canadian government's angle is that, you know, there's revenue at stake, and that's why there was movement on their part at all. Okay, well, I think this is a nice way to wrap up with our event today. But before we go, any books, audio, or audio that you'd recommend to our viewers?
Oh, well, there's a lot. You know what I'd recommend to your viewers is, and this isn't about self-promotion, it's just a very useful way of directing you to really good material. If you go on the Section 1 website, which is section number 1, .ca, you can go to the reading list there, and there is a whole bibliography of suggested reading on the subjects that we're talking about now, and a long list of really good material. Some stuff by me is there too, so I'll exclude that from the qualification, but all the other stuff is really great. And you know, a lot of great books on democracy and on the history of the decline of Republican government in previous sort of historical periods. I mean, one thing we need to recognize is that democracy is neither inevitable nor immortal. And in fact, there's no historical instance in which it has kind of lasted forever, in which it didn't decline. I think we're seeing that decline now throughout the West. The Republican Party in the United States is no longer a democratic political party. It's not committed to democracy. In fact, it seems to be committed to the kind of disruption and undoing of the, you know, sort of the institutionalized aspirations of the founders, of the founding fathers. But go on that website, because there you'll see a long list of really great reading material. www.section1.ca, and then go to the reading list page.
All right, thank you, Peter. I will please post a recap page to our LinkedIn page, and those of you that are interested in checking out the work and the recommendations on books that we could read to keep ourselves enlightened on this topic. And on that note, Peter, thank you so much for giving us your time today. So grateful for this in-depth.
Yeah. It's been an honor. It's been an honor et un grand plaisir. Malheureusement, on n'a pas eu l'occasion de le faire en français pour nos amis québécois et franco-ontariens, mais peut-être la prochaine fois. Thank you so much for inviting me, Mash.